Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at www.kyndryl.com, and they have just launched the Kyndryl Institute. Many of the authors and speakers from this show have been on there. They've written brilliant pieces, long-form articles. You can find that at kyndryl.com/institute. I was just telling him off air, I was delighted with the extra time to read his book and listen to it. I bought the Audible book. I took his lessons about multiple ways of listening to it. It is a fabulous book, and it's a pleasure to welcome back for part 3, our finale, the author of Productive Failure, Manu Kapur. Welcome back.
Thank you, Aidan. It's a pleasure to be back.
I thought we'd cover 3 things today: affect, assembly, and then for so many listeners of this show, we're ongoing life learners, and some of the hacks that you can have on yourself to push yourself beyond the zone. Let's tee it up that way. So let's start with affect, and I have a little tee up here for you, a little quote. You said, "When we fail to solve a problem correctly, in spite of trying multiple times to solve it, it creates something like a cliffhanger, just like you would see in a movie, a cognitive and affective cliffhanger. Having invested in the problem, we are eager to solve the correct solution." So we all know that somebody disturbs us when we're in the middle of doing something. We have an unfinished task, and we have loads of things we finished, but we remember that unfinished task. It bugs us like a buzzing fridge. So tell us what's at play here. What's going on inside our brain?
It's really that. I mean, we have the human psychology is wired in a way that you want to close the gaps, especially the ones that you've invested a lot of effort into. The memory trace stays with you, and both cognitively and affective. Cognitively, like you have the conception of you have an awareness that there is something I wanted to do and I do not accomplish it, precisely the nature of that thing. But also more affectively in terms of how you feel in that moment, right? So there is this unfinished business feeling, like that something is not complete yet or something is not fully closed. And I think that's the affective component, the emotions coming in.
We've talked about this on the show before, but your interpretation of it was really important in the learning aspect, which is the Zeigarnik Effect.
Yeah, so Zeigarnik Effect was shown a very long time ago. I was studying in the context of waiting staff who would seem to forget all the orders as soon as they completed them. But the ones that were still unfinished, those are the orders that would very easily remember. And these are not simple orders. These could be orders of a lot of people ordering all different kinds of stuff. And I think that's what sparked off this line of research. Why is it that things that remain incomplete actually spur us to remember them better and then hope to complete them? And the same thing if you apply for learning, it's like hacking that psychology into, that's what productive failure does. It hacks that psychology into saying, okay, you try this task, you're not going to be able to complete it fully, but then this Zeigarnik Effect is going to kick in, and then you will remember it better and you'd want to close it.
It's so counterintuitive to go, well, first, I'm going to actually create a gap of my knowledge. I'm going to maybe read the back of a book and kind of go, I have no idea what that's about, or launch into a course, or take the paper, as you say, discover what your gap is. And then this kicks in, this gap closure effect, the Zeigarnik Effect. But in the book, you talk about affective boost levels, and I'd love you to give us at a high level each of them: loss aversion, endowed progress, goal gradient.
Okay, so yeah, there are these 4 hacks that you could do. I mean, we've all heard of loss aversion, and that's Kahneman's prospect theory. Basically, the idea that if you've held on to something for long, you'll be more averse to losing it. So, for example, we hold on to our losses, whether it's in investments or relationships, for much longer than we actually should. And with profits, we don't stick with them for so long when we tend to give them up. So the idea, and loss aversion is a very well researched effect. And it's often seen as a negative thing because people are holding on to their losses and therefore they should let them go. In the context of learning, you can turn it into a hack by saying, okay, if you just try a problem, you've invested enough time in the problem and you still haven't been able to solve it correctly or canonically, right? That's from a loss aversion standpoint, that's a loss, that's a failure, right? And instead of saying, well, that's something you should let go, productive failure says, no, that's something you want to keep. And it's a good thing that in some situations there is loss aversion, especially like productive failure, because that keeps you in the game. And then it prepares you then to receive instruction or learn from it when that happens, right? So that's the first level. So create your own loss aversion in the learning context, knowing very well that the correct explanation or an expert or something, that there'll be some feedback for you to learn with. That the knowledge of that is important. In other words, you need to know that something is there that will help you, but then you will derive greater benefit from that help if you create your own loss aversion. So that's the first step, hack the loss aversion.
I just got a coffee, Manu, and the coffee shop gives out a loyalty card. And I was thinking exactly, I told the owner about the Endowed Progress Effect. So let's tell our audience about that one.
Yeah, so I hope, thanks, Aidan. So I hope your loyalty card, is it blank or does it already come with a couple of stickers?
There's one already printed on it, but more than that, they also give you 2 for your first coffee you buy with them.
Well, there you go. So that's the Endowed Progress Effect at play, where basically they figured out how to hack your motivation and affect in general. So if had they given you an empty card with, say, 5 or 8 slots to go, 8 empty, and then you get a free drink. And in your case, they gave you 2 extra free, in other words, and maybe it's a 10 slot card. In both cases, you have an equal number of, purchases to make before you get to the free cup, right? In the first case, you have, 8 to go. And the second case, also you have 8. Except in the first case, you have 2 already printed out of 10. And the psychology says that because you already have those 2, you are more likely to complete 8 after the 2 that have already been endowed upon you, as opposed to starting from scratch and just doing 8. Right? And I think that's what, in the learning context, in addition to loss aversion, this is why I call it on top of loss aversion, you've already endowed upon yourself a certain amount of effort. You've already made a certain amount of progress, albeit small, but even that is enough for us from an affective standpoint to spur on and say, well, I'm going to try and go in. I'm more likely to go the distance and complete this wherever it takes.
I read this, I didn't know this until I read it in your book, was the guy who did the research on that in 2006, Joseph Nunes and Xavier Drez. Joseph Nunes is his brother is Paul Nunes, who many people who listen to the show will know well. He's a regular contributor to the show, brilliant, prolific author as well. So shout out to Joseph Nunes for doing that research on the car washes, which was where the study came from about endowed progress. And then endowed progress actually links beautifully into goal gradient, because they go goal gradient, which they go together so well.
Yeah, and one of the ways in which I hack endowed progress and turn it into goal gradient, and I'll get into that, is because of a bad knee, my main exercise is swimming. So I go to the pool and I try to do my laps. And there are days after a long day of work, you really don't feel like getting into the pool, right? It's just like, I'm not going to go. And so that's when I tell myself, look, I'm just going to go in and do 1 lap. And if that's all I do today, I'm going to get out of the pool and say it's a success, right? And so that's why endowed progress is a hack. Basically, I tell myself 1 lap is enough. I get into the pool, I do my 1 lap, and guess what? The endowed progress kicks in. I said, oh, I'm already here, and now I might as well do another and another. And that's when the goal gradient starts to kick in. And that's the idea that the closer you get to the goal of completing, if your target was 10 or 20, the closer you get to the goal, the more motivated you get to achieving that goal, right? Or to completing that goal. And I think that's what you want to kick in. So both to get started with something, to endow yourself very quickly with some progress, and when that kicks in, convert it into a goal gradient. And with the goal gradient, I think you might also, there's another related hack where you can move the goalpost. So if the goal is too far, then it becomes hard for you the gradient is very steep, and therefore it's hard to go So you may want to tell, okay, I've already done 1 or 2 laps today. Let me just get to 5. When I get to 5, I'll see what happens. So again, breaking it down, moving the goalpost, making your goals smaller, and then hacking your way along. So assuming then that you've hacked the Endowed progress by shifting the goalpost smartly, you've got into benefiting from the goal gradient, and say you're closer to completing, and there is this beauty of completion itself. Like at the very last bit, that's where you see athletes and, almost they just find some energy from somewhere in the last lap, the last 2 laps, where you just go. I don't know where they get that burst from. And of course, part of it is training, but part of it is also affect. And that's what we're talking about. Like there is this affective charge that you really want to complete when you're very close to it. And same in the context of learning. Investing something gives you you are more likely, so just to summarize it all, right? So before learning something, if you invest effort into designing your own exploration first, even if you don't get to the right answer, then that investment creates a loss aversion in a good way. It also gives you an endowed progress because you've invested something, right? You want to carry on, you want to complete the affect. And then the more you do that, the closer you get to the goal, you get the goal gradient effect. And when you're right there, when you're very close to learning how to solve the problem correctly, the joy, the affect, the emotions, and just completing that last bit in and of itself is the final sort of hurdle or the hack that really helps.
It's a brilliant thing to do as well, Manu. So I've coached kids and adults before in rugby, but also my own son. So my son now is winning BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA. But he, like years ago, he was not athletic at all. And I actually, unbeknownst to myself, used these different things. It's nice to be able to put a label on them and see what they were, but it was stuff like, let's go for a jog. Day 1, we just put on our runners and walked around the block, and day 2, just jogged to the corner. And then when we get there, it's like going, we've got here, why don't we just do one more? And just build. You kind of do these things not knowing what they are. And I think knowing, and this is again what you do in this book, is you put a label on these things, you be able to see them. And in doing so, then you get a dopamine and a serotonin hit because you're like feeling achievement about, I actually followed that formula and it works. But the reason I say that is I bring up a child, for example, is there's an important aspect then as well, which is the growth mindset. And we won't go deep into that because I hope a lot of our audience know about the growth mindset, but let's mention it here as well because it's such an important aspect to get through with all this, to go through with all this. And then we'll talk about the importance of curiosity as well.
Yeah. No, so the growth mindset is an idea that's been around for a very long time, and it is the idea that effort matters. Yes, people have innate abilities, individual differences in innate abilities, but effort matters. Effort can drive competence, and effort is ultimately about action. Action is within your locus of control. Your inborn ability or whatever individual differences, those are not within your control. That's your lottery, so to speak. But effort is within your control, and if effort matters, if effort can change and help you grow and develop, then having that kind of a mentality or a mindset actually helps you. The question is, how do you develop this kind of a mindset? And again, there's a feedback loop, the affective feedback loop from all these hacks is you see that effort, that if you can hack your effort and then you derive benefit from that, you say, oh, wow, at the start, I couldn't see myself doing this, but I came this far and then I felt like doing a little bit more and then hacking the rest of it. And then you said, effort really matters. So the next time I'm in that kind of zone where I'm thinking, maybe I don't want to do this, or maybe I don't want to put in the effort, you actually have action proof that you've been there, you've done that, and that it works. And that just increases the likelihood. And the more you do it, the more cycles you go through it. That kind of action actually builds the mindset. So it's really action driven. I think that's the point. It's not something you can't tell it to somebody that you should think. Yeah, you can. I mean, obviously you can. But what really works is action drives affect. And then affect drives more action. So that primacy of action is key.
I found the book so helpful, like you, as a retired athlete, and having put so much into being an athlete and then having to start at zero at a much later stage than everybody else. And it was the first time I ever did this. I went and looked at where I was now. I was looking at the goal gradient, and I love this. I read it somewhere, this story of if you're swimming across a channel, most people will look and go, look how far we have to go. And you're going to go, look how far you've come. And this was the first time in my life I actually did that. And I went, oh, I've come such a long way since 2009, which was a terrible time to retire from the sport. Yeah. But in a way, there was so much water, under the bridge and that I covered. And it was really helpful to do that. And I think that was such an important part of the book. And it made me realize actually it's one of the reasons I do this show and why I'm so attracted to this book, because I really do believe in human progress and personal progress. Yet I'm so surprised all the time to see so many people not believe that they can do it. And I think reading the book and hopefully listening to us as well, that's what I do, a little bit of executive coaching, but it inevitably turns into this, where it's going, why don't you do this? Why don't you write a book? Why don't you do something that is, I can see there's something in you. There's a seed in there that you're not tapping into. And I that's what I love about what you've done here. And we'll talk about that. I'm leaving that as a hook. We're going to finish talking about hacking you and using productive failure on yourself, because you can absolutely do that. And we're going to conclude with that. But we better keep going on this. But one of the things I thought was so important was children and uncertainty, and the studies by Elizabeth Bonowitz, for example, where we're in a time of extreme uncertainty. I think we always were as humans, but we've been spoiled for the period since World War II until a few years ago, put it that way. But we lost that change muscle, or that uncertainty muscle, but we inherently have it. And that's what I learned from these studies. I'd love you to share the importance of children and uncertainty and some of the studies.
The basic idea of studying children is that during childhood, we experience steepest learning curve, right? And if you could study what drives the mechanisms that drive these steep learning curves, then perhaps we can also hack them and use them throughout our lives. And of course, yes, the patterns are different, but they're instructive. They're interesting to see. So the broad class of studies I would describe is as this. Suppose to your audience, imagine you're a kid who loves to play with toys, right? And if I divide you into, say, two different kinds of group. In group one, I'd say, well, hey, here's a new toy. I show you some random object. I say, here's a new toy. Hey, would you like to play with it? You've never seen or heard about this toy. Would you like to play with it? And you say, yeah, I want to play with it. And I say, okay, here's the toy. Play with it. Try to figure out how it works. Play as you like. Okay? That's group one. And then group two, I say, well, same question, same toy. Do you want to play with it? And you say, yeah, I want to play with it. And I say, well, hang on a second. You've never seen it. You've never played with it. Let me first show you how to play with it. And then you can figure out and play as you like. So I show you exactly how to play with that toy, right? And then after that, you watched and learned. And then I give you the toy and say, hey, figure it out as you like, play as you like. And so both groups have the same toy, same instruction in terms of play as you like and try to figure things out. Except in group two, they have more knowledge about the toy because they've been told exactly how the toy functions, right? Or work. The question is, when the children are given these toys to play with, which group, one or two, spends more time figuring out the toy? Which one is more engaged? Which one tries to invent scientific strategies almost to figure out the causality of how the toy works? Or which group is more creative? And if you answer, and one by one, if you answer these questions, invariably the results show that it's group one that is more creative, right? And so there's something about playing and tinkering in the context of things that are puzzling or uncertain that need to be figured out that hack our attention. They keep us in the game. They make us almost behave, even though we're children, they make us behave like mini scientists trying to do hypothesis testing to figure out how the toy works. And all of it is really the curiosity that's driven by uncertainty that's placed upon us, as long as we are in that safe space within which we can play and have fun. And so I've always found these sets of studies to be really interesting, because then one could start to think of, when you think of concepts or ideas or knowledge, these are not like physical toys, but you can start to think of conceptual toys. And we all want to be deeply engaged with knowledge and ideas. We want to be able to experiment with them. We want to be able to be creative with them, and all of these things that we say are important for learning. When we design learning, we do the exact opposite of that. We basically go to group 2 and say, this is something new, you've never learned it. Let me first tell you what it is. Let me just teach you. Nothing wrong with that per se. But we deprive the students and ourselves of the opportunity that group 1 is. And that's the idea. That curiosity is, of course, part of it is there are individual differences in curiosity. But a part of it is also driven by the uncertainty in the context within which we find ourselves.
And I thought we'd share a couple of things. I just wanted to tell you as well, I lecture, as you know, in Trinity College here in Dublin, and I use this. I actually looked at my lectures, because it's coming up in November now, my lecture series. And I was like, I'm not doing a lot of these things. So I've actually rearranged it, put in new slides, starting with some questions to ask people to go, if you had to take the test now, what would you do? And so I'm looking forward to practicing it. And now I'm able to go, this is not me. This is a guy who studied this. And
like with all of it.
No, but it's great, man. I'm looking forward to actually putting it into practice. Last thing before we move on to assembly, which is the 4th A, and just to remind you, we covered the first 2 A's last day, is I thought it was important to mention. So here we've talked about curiosity, so raising the curiosity, which is also stuff like you go and figure it out yourself. But achievement goals versus performance goals, I thought was an important one, because we see this in organizations. Sometimes I'm flabbergasted when I went from the sports field to the business field. I couldn't believe how some people just figured that the task done was enough. And I was going, but it's terrible. It's like, it's terrible work. Like, how can you be proud of that? And I realized actually this is probably something to do with achievement versus mastery. And again, this is where the job done, is that enough? And there's some people, like I would definitely think I'm one of them, where it's not just enough to do the thing. You want to actually be really good at it. And this is why I love doing the show, Manu, like reading the book, getting to interview the author, listening to the audiobook, and then I actually edit it myself, because it's another learning experience for me. So let's share these ideas, because you'll see yourself here.
In every learning situation, we bring in certain goals that sometimes are implicit or explicit, and people have tried to study what these goals that people have and the nature of the goals itself influences how you're engaged in the task or your learning task. Broadly speaking, there are achievement goals and mastery goals. And achievement goals are the like where I just want to complete it. I want to get to the end state. I want to be able to solve the problem, and so on. So this would look like, if you're given a task, you complete the task. If you're on an exam, you want to pass the exam. You want to do just enough so that you get on with things. Whereas mastery goals are where you really want to understand why you're doing what you're doing. Why do things work the way they are? What if something could be the other way around? And what if I change something? So those are the real deep understanding and mastery-oriented goals. And so why these are important in the context of productive failure is what failure does, in addition to the ABLEs, the other 4 affective boost levels, it gets you into this orientation where, having invested the effort but still not having completed or got to the solution, when you get to a situation where a teacher or an expert, or you have access to the solution or feedback, you're in the zone you're in the mastery orientation where you really you're not just satisfied with getting the information. You want to understand, why is it that way? What was I doing that was either incorrect or suboptimal? And how does that strategy compare with this expert strategy, so that it is in the contrast, and it's in asking the why about the contrast that I begin to understand, this is why it worked, the aha kind of a moment. I could still just, okay, all right, I tried this way, and the the professor or the teacher is going the other way, the correct way, and I can learn it. But it's the invested effort that really drives a mastery orientation. Whereas if you don't have that initial investment in that productive failure, then you just go into this learning situation. So, okay, I'll learn something new today. Maybe I'll try to understand what it is, but yeah, my goal is to achieve that and then get on with it. And I think that's an achievement level. And then throughout our lives, it's not to say that everything has to be about mastery, because I don't need to understand the chemistry of how eggs are made. I just want to get some scrambled eggs for breakfast, right? So, okay, I don't need mastery there unless you're learning to be a chef. Then maybe you do want to. My point is not to denigrate one kind of from the other, but really in cases where you want deep understanding of some of the things you're about to learn, it actually helps to have a mastery orientation as opposed to simply.
I love when my kids ask me questions that I don't know the answer to, and I like stuff like that, like why is the eggshell that way? And I go, let's ask ChatGPT, which is great now. Before we had to go to the, if you had one, Encyclopedia Britannica and go through that pain, but now it's so simple. But I love because they'll ask stuff that we take for granted a lot of the time and actually don't know the answer to, and I'll just actually go, that's a great question, let's see, and then share it with them. And I'll do the vocal one, so they'll have to listen to it with me. So it's a great way to learn from their curiosity. We better keep moving. And next up was the last of the A's, which is assembly. I shared this on LinkedIn with a small post, and it went viral because people love this idea of somebody proposes something, you slam the idea, and you talked about the keynote, for example, with the physics professors, and the answer is either right or no, right or wrong, black and white, and you kind of go, no, it can't be. There's Lego blocks, there's hints of the answer in there if you take the time to go looking for them. So that's the tee up. But even before that, you talked about P-prims, and this was proposed by Andrea de Sessa. You sent me down the rabbit hole checking out his work as well, by the way, man. But I've teed you up there with loads. Take us away.
So basically the idea is that through our lived experiences, we develop intuitive conceptions about things that are reduced to a point where they're just axiomatic in nature. They don't need any more explanations. They are self-evident. For example, if I drop something, it will fall. Like it will fall, right? Or if I go near a heat source, I will feel warm. If things are moving, something must be making them move. Like inanimate objects don't have will, right? So these kinds of things, right? And this is what Andrea de Sessa, who's the scientist or the scholar who really came up with this idea, is that we have all these, what he calls self-evident axiomatic conceptions about the world that he calls phenomenological primitives. So they're primitive to the point where in describing or making sense of a phenomenon, hence the phenomenological primitives. And children come into classrooms, or and adults too, learning in the learning situation, come into the learning situations with all these conceptions, right? And oftentimes these conceptions are incorrect, or in the context, they are incorrect. And so, for example, if you ask people what makes seasons, right, or the summer and winter, most people will use the P-prim or the idea that, it must be summer because we are closer to the sun, to a heat source. It's so intuitive, right? But in fact, the opposite. From a planetary standpoint, motion standpoint, what makes seasons actually the tilt of the earth. And so the idea is that in some contexts these conceptions don't work. In other contexts, they actually do work. So if you're around a fire, you don't want to be, going too close, or else, or if you want heat, you want to go close to it. In those contexts, the same conception actually works very well. In other contexts, it does not. And hence the idea that in any learning situation, if a child presents an idea or makes a claim, from an expert standpoint, you may very well go and say, well, that just doesn't work. Sorry, that's a wrong idea, right? And the alternative is to say, well, actually, let's hunt for context within which that actually works, and then contrast those contexts with other contexts where it does not. Now, imagine that is really powerful, right? And that's what we want to do, not just for learning, is to productive failure tries to uncover these intuitive ideas and concepts that people bring into a new learning situation. And instead of dismissing the whole concept, you say, well, is there something about what the person is saying that could actually be used? And that's where I call this components, right? And I treat them as Lego blocks. So the moment you make a claim about something, you try to find, okay, this claim has 3 Lego blocks, And I say, instead of dismissing this assembly of 3 Lego blocks and the whole because it doesn't work, say, okay, some of it doesn't work, but maybe there's something there. And hence my classic example is, the object moving on a frictionless surface. And if you ask people, even adults, right, if the object has a force, that's making it, most people would say, yes, the object is moving, therefore there's a force. And any physicist would say, no, that's not true. There's no force. And so instead of dismissing that, you can then say, well, actually the intuitive idea that the object has some physical property is true. It does have it, and it's called momentum, and you were just calling it force, but it's actually momentum. There is a momentum in the direction of the motion, but there's no force. And then you can start to compare and contrast, And I think those are the ways in which we want to treat children's ideas or naive conceptions or initial conceptions, initial intuitions that people bring into new learning situations. And the more you can do that, creates more opportunities to compare and contrast and drive deep understanding.
In the interest of time, I thought we'd move on to the power of comparison or contrast. We had a show a few years ago, a guy called Patrick Renvoise, a French guy who wrote about the concept of neuromarketing, which is marketing to the brain. And he talked about how important it was in marketing. He said, so say you have a weight loss drug and you show somebody who's overweight or unhealthy beside somebody who's really fit and lean, and that the brain just understands contrast. That's why you have like red and green and these kind of things together, because they just speak straight to the brain. But you bring that a step further here with productive failure.
Contrasts are key. I mean, imagine alien lands on Earth and we want them to understand what a dog is. And you just show them a picture of a dog. Here's a dog. Try to learn what a dog is. Or you want another example. Let me show you another example of a dog. And this is a dog. How much would they learn, or how many trials would they need to learn what a dog is, right? Probably many. And still they would not get a full understanding or fuller understanding. Imagine now I put a dog and a cat, for instance, and something that's entirely different, right? Maybe a mouse. Study these 3 and figure out what a dog is. This is a dog, by the way, but figure out what makes a dog. Now, that kind of a contrast, which is designed in a way for you to notice the differences between objects or between things, and the differences are the critical things that you need to notice, is something that we pick up very quickly. I think from an evolutionary standpoint, one could even make the argument that if in our field of vision something changed, we have more desire to pick it up, because that could mean life or death if you're out hunting, right? Whereas if I give you 5 different things and I say, what is similar across all of these things? Well, that is a lot of effort that goes into thinking about similarity, whereas differences are very to bootstrap or pick up and bootstrap. And so the hack there for learning is, why don't we let differences drive our attention to what is critical, because we can design for them and then have students or learners pick that up. And that's where contrasts come in. You design contrasts to be similar in particular ways, but different in the ways that you want things to notice. So if you want to notice the hair color, you put 2 Aidens there, and one with black and the other with blonde. Then the people would know, hair color is an important difference between them. Right? So whatever it is that you want people to notice, that's what you want to create the contrast in, and they will pick it up. And then you take.
I loved when you talked about the learning through metaphor or case studies, for example, and I took a lesson in that, because this chapter actually taught me a lot about how I learn, which is a lot of it's like reading the book, interviewing you, listening to it, and editing it, but then writing about it loosely. So some little hook like the Zeigarnik Effect or the idea of goal grading or something, I'll lean on that, or some study that you mentioned. I'll go, actually, that's just like this. And then I'll build it from there. And then I'll use a case study from business to go, well, this happened in business. But I don't always use two. And actually, that was something I learned from you, that one is effective, but two was way more effective. And here you talked about the example of the general. Maybe you'll give us that at a high level.
People have studied this quite a lot. And then this was a study in transfer where suppose you have a general who wants to conquer a fortress, right? And the fortress is fortified, obviously, right? And you want to find out, and there are many ways you can conquer it. One is to go down one path and send his entire army through one path, but say that path is not sustainable, or maybe there's not enough to send the entire army through that. So what does the general decide to do as an alternative strategy? So that's the main goal. Now, in the context of, say, surgery or medicine, suppose you have a tumor in your body, right? And you want to kill it with radiation, right? And so you have several options. You can have radiation directly on that, but if the level of radiation power needed to kill it will actually damage everything above it as well. So you don't want that, right? So how does a surgeon go about killing the tumor without killing everything yourself in the process, right? And so structurally, if you think about these two problems, they're very similar, right? Yet if you give these problems to people, they are often unable to solve it, all right? But if you give one problem and they're unable to solve it, and then you tell them, actually, what if the radiation comes from multiple sides so that each power is less, so you don't damage it, but when they converge to a point, boom, that's enough power to kill them. And suppose you get this, and then you get to the general problem, the general's problem, the war problem. Turns out more people are able to transfer from the radiation problem to the war problem. Because of the contrast, they're able to see, okay, yes, the contexts are different, but maybe so the general should go down, attack the fortress from multiple parts, and converge the force on the fortress that way, exactly like a radiation. So again, that's the power of contrast. That contrast, they cue us, and this is the issue, that the contrast, in comparing and contrasting, you understand the similarity, and within the similarities, you pick up the differences that then cue you to transfer this from one context to the other.
You said in the studies that they did that the researchers gave the radiation question or query or case, and then they gave the general case, that there was only like 9% of people got it. And they were like, oh, what the heck? And then they were like, and then they spelled it out. You know when you watch a movie or a series on TV and they spell out the obvious plot and you're like going, you didn't have to do that, I got it. But actually, a lot of people don't get it. And what I found really interesting was, you said in that study, when they added a second case of transfer, it went up to like 40%.
Still, that's not a lot. With transfer is generally very hard. But yes, the idea is contrast can cue you. And that's why learning from a single case is so hard. That's also illustrative in this example. We all use it all the time, expecting people to learn from a single case. But really, learning from a single case is, but if you learn from two contrasting but analogous cases, you drive up the transfer.
When somebody's more expert or leans into mastery more, I always think about how, say you were writing this book, I'm sure you had many times where you're like kind of going, do I have enough information here? You know, the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the more you know, the more you think you don't know, which is true, which is, I'm reminded of every day with that library behind me. The more you lean into mastery, the more you realize what you don't know, and that you just see the size of the well of knowledge, and you just go, wow, so much to learn there.
Wow.
And there has to be a moment where you just do a code freeze and you go, I cannot take on any more knowledge here because I need to write this thing. I think that actually freezes a lot of people. And the reason I say that was, you too, everybody has imposter syndrome. And you talk about a way to deal with imposter syndrome, which was great wisdom from your father.
Yeah, that's how we grow, really. I think to save our face, we say that, we are okay. But actually, the imposter syndrome is a very common phenomenon at all levels in all domains. Like my dad used to say, well, your ambition should always exceed your talent. And I'm sure other people have said this in different ways, but the basic idea is that if you're always doing things that are within your current skill set and abilities, then yeah, that's great, but you're being very safe and you won't learn or grow much if you stay in that zone, right? So it's really, you need to go and take on challenges that you very knowingly, that are beyond your current skill set and abilities. And that's where you end up in a zone where you'll struggle and you'll question yourself. And you'll find yourself, you can say, do I belong here? I went to ETH Zurich as a professor when I was 40, and ETH Zurich, where my university where my professorship is, the likes of Albert Einstein and Pauli and 30 other Nobel laureates have roamed the same corridors. doors. And really go there and say, yeah, do I belong here at least, right? But that's the whole point. Like, yes, belonging is a function of your efforts and growth. But you need to put yourself out there to be able to do that.
We're going to come to that next for those people who want to go, well, what does this mean to me? Last thing I just want to learn on this, because it's important, which is some people, if you think about, say, the idea of imprinting, Konrad Lorenz, the idea that the first thing you learn during a critical window of learning sticks, and it's very hard to erase that once that happens. But you're talking about productive failure at a later level, although children do it naturally all the time. But one of the criticisms that comes up is concerns about learning the wrong things and that they are imprinted. But luckily you tell us pruning and promoting are two things that take care of that. So maybe you'll deal with this.
In the early years, we know that, that we are born with many more neurons than you need. And over time, as you learn, there's a lot of pruning that goes on. And over time, then you have the number of neurons actually decrease because you're learning and so on and so forth. And even in adult settings, or as well, our teenage years and adult, we've come to believe that, if you learn the wrong thing, it stays with you. And therefore, people are critical of things like productive failure and say, oh, what if they do this wrong thing first because they don't know the correct thing? What if they do the wrong thing first? And then when you're trying to, they have to correct that. And now, one way to do that is, one way to say it is, well, this problem is merely empirical. Let's just test it, right? So if you test it and you find that, okay, even if you had the wrong conception first, when it got corrected with feedback, people have the ability to actually correct it and then learn the correct one, especially. And we see that in our empirical evidence. That's exactly what happens. It also matters how you correct it. So, one way of correcting it is to say, as you talked about, well, that's just wrong entirely, as opposed to there's some parts of it is correct, are useful. Let me build on that to teach you the correct conception. So that the right way or the more powerful way of correcting, giving somebody feedback and assembling that into canonical knowledge and the correct knowledge. So if you do that, I think what we find is people are actually able to overcome or build upon their misconceptions and right conceptions and non-correct conceptions on top of it. Now, if you don't do that, people may display in certain contexts the correct ideas, but the moment those contexts are very different, they go back to their old naive ways of thinking. And also studies show that even the top colleges, physics students, when, again, back to seasons, they can answer the questions in physics and get good marks in an exam. But when you go back to, what explains seasons, they go back to, actually, it's how close you are, which is, And so the reason why we worry about misconceptions or wrong conceptions or wrong ideas is that we don't really engage with them in a way to correct them so that they persist over time.
This tees us up beautifully for using productive failure for our own growth, learning, and harnessing the productive failure design principles. We didn't cover that in depth in this show because there's a chapter dedicated to designing for other people. So if you're a corporate trainer, if you're a lecturer, if you're a teacher, designing productive failure, design is absolutely key because you can't get it wrong. You hacked productive failure, and you said the way to hack productive failure, to red team it, is, well, if you get the design wrong, you're in trouble with productive failure. So it's a really important chapter. And I didn't want to go there because I really wanted to focus on us, the individuals. So let's talk about that, because productive failure on a personal level includes things like feedback. So a group, a trusted learning group that you lean into something together, participation, social surround, mind setting, all these things are really important. I'd love you to take us through this for people to go, here's how I would deal with it myself. And then I also have the diagram, Manu, that I could share that maybe you could speak to.
Sure. So the idea really is, when you design productive failure for yourself, is to think in 3 nested layers. Whatever you're trying to learn, whether it's tennis or scrambled eggs or learning how to cook, learning some math, the idea is the same. The 3 levels. The first level is the task. How do you design the task itself that you're about to learn? What features must this task have? And the more features, the more the task has certain features, it is likely to work better as a productive failure task. And then once you've got the task design, you've got to think about, okay, how do I work on this task? Do I work individually by myself? Do I work with other people? When do I, and what do I do with the kinds of ideas I come up with, right? And what do I do with those ideas? So I think that's the participation layer, that, you design the task, how do you then work and interact with the task? And the biggest layer where you deal with, your culture and values and mindset, is what I call the social surround layer, where you've got to design your learning. You've got to be mindful of setting the kinds of learning goals, valuing effort, feedback, and so on and so forth. So it's a coordination across these 3 levels. And in the first instance, it can be quite daunting to want to do so many things at the same time. So my advice usually is to, start small, get a couple of these things going, and then slowly add features as you go along and become more and more used to productive failure for yourself.
I'm going to leave on the screen, for those people who are only listening to us, I recommend looking at this. So it's around 50 minutes into the show on YouTube. If you go there, you'll see the diagram. But let's put it in practice here, because you give an example. You say here, and I'm going to pick this one, learning a new project management software, because so many of us will have to learn new skills in an age of AI. So a decontextualized way of learning would involve consulting a manual or a series of generic training videos. That's what most people do. An organization might go, here, you can go onto our LMS or learning management software. You can go on there, you can learn how to use AI or whatever. But that's not as effective as learning in the context of actual use. So I'd love you to tell us about this, because I think this is so important in today's world.
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on the learning goals you have, right? You have the goals are to learn this new piece of software or the management system, as opposed to just use it as told or blindly, or just go through the procedures. Those are 2 different strategies. So provided the goals are learning goals, I think one would really want to have the time and the space to actually play with the tool or the software or the system in the context of your regular work. And chances there are that you will make certain errors, or you will go around about things or do things in not the most efficient ways of using the features for productivity and so on and so forth. But you may try some interesting things as well. And the idea is, once you've played with the system, explored the system, tinkered with the system, gone through the more non-efficient parts through the system, if you just did that for a bit, and then somebody told you, okay, well, you wanted to do this activity or achieve this through the system, well, this is how you actually do it, or this is one way of achieving it the most efficient ways. Now, that contrast, again, we spoke about contrasts between how you tried something and how the system was designed to work efficiently. I think it's that contrast that helps you understand, oh, I tried it this way. Well, actually, this is indeed a more efficient way. Or not. Maybe you've discovered something that even the experts haven't, right? So it can happen. So, again, so that's the idea that, designing safe spaces for people to explore and tinker with systems and tasks and challenges, and then providing them with the knowledge and the skills or toolkits that guide them through the correct path. I think that creates deeper learning.
We talked about affect, and I don't know if we gave enough of a description of what affect is, but maybe affective draw, I thought, is a good way to describe what affect is, because people will often get in touch with me and go, hey, I'm thinking of starting a podcast. I go, well, what are you interested in? Because that's where you're going to keep at it and keep doing it, etc. I'd love you to tell us about this, because this is such an important thing that if you're going to go after something to master or lean into a new skill, affective draw is key.
Yeah, I mean, as you said it, Aidan, start with something that you like, or find a window into something, or pathway into something towards a goal through something you like. If you want to study statistics and you love football or rugby, well, go after the tables and statistics and data in football and rugby. You're more likely to be engaged in that as opposed to accounting numbers from a pro. It could be the same numbers, same statistic, but really for yourself, and just hack your way into learning something new through something that you're automatically engaged with. The idea that you will stay in it, you'll be more likely to persist in it for much longer than in other contexts. And that's the idea of an affective draw. When you're designing for others, you have to know what others want, and then you design it for them so that you increase the likelihood of them staying in the game for longer. But in the case of designing for yourself, well, you know yourself, and then you go finding, okay, I want to learn this, but let me go by this route that I am very sure.
One of the things in both contexts, so designing for others and designing for yourself, is to minimize computational load. This one is vital.
This is just the idea that initially you want to focus a lot of effort, or most of the effort, on sense making and not so much on computing stuff. So if the language is hard to understand, or there's too much technical stuff involved initially, or, if you're learning addition, or if you're learning statistics again, or comparing, say, performances of two firms, the profit in one firm is 5,400,674, and the other one is 5,300,000. Oh, okay, that's a high computation load. Whereas if you're for sense making, you just want to know, okay, here the profit is greater, here is not as great. Here the revenue is greater, here is not as great, and so forth. You want just simple numbers, simple information, non-technical stuff in the initial learning, and focus much of your effort in really making sense of that information as opposed to computing on it. Because that's where you get lost in the details, and you lose the forest for the trees. Now, of course, such complexity, authentic complexity, is important. But it can come later. It can come later after you've learned the underlying context, the ideas, the concepts. Then you can take on any complex, authentic context. Then your load can be higher. That's fine, because you already have the knowledge to deal with it. But when you're about to learn something new, it's always good to keep things, or at least a computational aspect, both in terms of language, any language, mathematical or otherwise, both in terms of representations, visuals, everything really simple, so that the learner is really focusing on making sense of the information and not lost in computation.
This is why I use LLMs in particular, is some paper that's written academically is often very difficult to understand, because you're like, what the heck are they trying to say here? And I'll often take a passage and put it into ChatGPT and go, tell me what this means, like I'm 12, and it will describe it. And as a result, then I'll actually compute much better. I thought we better start wrapping up. The last one here that I'm going to pick out is self-facilitation via hacking. So I thought this is so important, not only for yourself, but also, say, for example, you're an innovator and you're trying to describe a new idea to an organization or present it as something the organization should invest in. I thought this was a great tip.
Yeah, so there are two ways to take your ideas further. First is simply to learn how to explain that idea. And chances are, as you explain ideas, as you stand in front of a mirror and talk to yourself or explain to yourself what the idea is, you'll find ways of improving upon the explanations, making it more succinct, and maybe even end up changing those explanations and finding new ways to explain things. And so that's the basic layer with which all of us have to. And children do that, actually. If you think about children, the idea that they talk to themselves a lot it's something that, and we as adults it becomes our inner speech, but I think in terms of learning, if you can externalize it again, it becomes an object to reflect upon, to interrogate, and so on and so forth. So I think explanation or externalizing your ideas is an important skill set that one needs to develop more and more. The second bit is about the second hack that you really want to do is to what I call the counterfact. Right? And that is, you want to ask yourself, when would my idea not work? Can I think of a situation or a context where my idea, as it stands, as I'm explaining it, would really not work? And that is something that really pushes thinking, counterfactual thinking. That's what we do in science. In fact, that's one of the most important questions that would drive science to generalize and create more and more powerful ideas is to ask the question, when does this idea not work? How can I fail this idea? How can I, because it's in asking that question that you're really pushing the boundaries of your own thing.
And when somebody asks that question as an innovator and you go, brilliant question, I've thought through it, and then you have a slide on it, it's nothing better when that happens.
That's exactly. And it shows that you've done the groundwork, right? That you've been your own, as they call it, devil's advocate to prove your idea.
Manu, I have a final quote that I love that I'm going to finish on. I'm going to finish on that in a moment, and then I'm going to ask you just to wrap up our series. But at the end of the book, you give the 4 big takeaways from the book. I'd love you to give us those at a very top level.
The 4 big ideas, the 4 biggest takeaways. First is, we need to think about failure as an important mechanism for learning. We're not used to thinking about that. And if you're not using failure deliberately to design for learning, then you're not optimizing your learning, right? So that's one. Productive failure is all about deliberately designing and bootstrapping failure for learning. So that's failure as mechanism is an important idea that we need to learn. Second is failure signal. And this is the idea that oftentimes when you look at your portfolio or what you've done, if everything that you're doing is a success, right, then one could really question whether you have been brave enough or courageous enough, adventurous enough to try things that are beyond your skill set. So obviously we don't want everything to be failure, although that happens as well when you're really in a new situation. So what we want is to start looking for in your life, in your work, in your learning, where you're getting the failure signal, right? The idea that, oh, maybe these are the places where I'm really pushing my boundaries, where I'm really pushing and growing. As long as that failure is not because of, stupidity, incompetence, and laziness, those are not the failures, but really the failure that comes because you are pushing the envelope. You're really going after challenging things. And you need to be aware, both whether you're managing people or teams or organizations, but also personally, your own stuff. Where is your failure signal? As long as, again, that failure is not due to something incompetent or stupidity or laziness, right? That means you need to know that because that's telling you where you're growing. Right? So first, use failure as a mechanism, then use failure as a signal. Learn to look after it. And this is very hard for people to do, both for themselves and when they are, designing for others or leading others. Then the third bit is failure as a feature. And this is the idea that, we tend to, when failure happens, we tend to treat it as a bug. Something went wrong. Whereas we treat it as a feature, we say, well, this is a natural byproduct of us or you or teams or organization trying to go after challenging innovation and so on and so forth. So when you start to think about failure as a feature, you start to build a culture that is supportive of treating such kinds of failure as the norm rather than the exception. So make failure the feature. And what that would do is it'll help you drive the design for failure as a mechanism better. It'll help you also look for failure as a signal because you're in the safe space where failure is a feature of the system that you're creating, right? And so once you do these 3 things, mechanism, signal, and failure as a feature in a synergistic manner, then over time you find yourself in a kind of where failure becomes a mantra for life. It doesn't matter what context, where you are, and what you do. It just becomes who you are. And I think that's the ultimate transformation that somebody could aim for, to find that place where it just becomes themselves.
Manu, for people who want to find you, where's the best place to find you in the book?
You can Google me, my website, manukapur.com, the books landing page, productivefailure.com, but also at any bookseller like Amazon and such. Thank you.
I have a lovely quote here that I just thought encapsulates it and also entails a contrast, which is nice. I'm going to quote that and I'm going to hand over to you to sign off on the series. You wrote that in traditional classroom settings, and I would argue here, universities, executive learning, and boardrooms, the norms and expectations often revolve around the acquisition of correct answers and the avoidance of mistakes. Students or executives are often rewarded for quick, accurate recall of information and penalized for incorrect responses, leading to a fear of failure and a reluctance to take on challenges and intellectual risks. Such an environment, which Manu calls social surround, can stifle creativity, discourage deep understanding, and inhibit the development of critical thinking skills. Productive failure stands in stark contrast. It adopts new norms and expectations that embrace the value of failure and mistakes while taking on challenging tasks. The importance of effort and the process of learning itself becomes essential in fostering a more effective and engaging educational experience. This shift requires a fundamental change in how students, executives, perceive what is expected of them, their role in the learning process, and how they interpret their successes and their failures. I thought that was beautifully put and is the cherry on top for me. I absolutely love talking to you. What's your final message? Why did you write this book?
Well, why did I write this book? Well, it just came. You come to a point in your career where you feel that the message you want to bring across to the world or your contribution to the world has to be encapsulated in ways that people can understand. Right? Science is one thing, communicating that is another. And so that's how this whole effort came about.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Author of Productive Failure, Manu Kapur, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. It's been a pleasure throughout this series.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's largest and leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com, and you can find the kyndryl.com/institute, where you'll find many of the authors and guests from the show who have written long-form content. It's a brilliant resource, free resource, and you can download the Kyndryl app or go to that website /institute.